Hi everyone, we're back. I'm Mark Wasilyu. I'm the MLA for Fort Garry. I want to welcome you to our second podcast episode on The Ledge, podcast dedicated to all things provincial politics. So we are in the middle of a federal election, and we have a great interview this week with Jorge Requena Ramos, the NDP candidate for Winnipeg South Centre. We talk punk rock politics and how we can make change in Canada, even if you're the underdog candidate. We also explored in this week's episode the culture change in the Manitoba NDP and its relationship with the Federal NDP, how things have changed since I was a federal candidate 20 years ago to how the provincial government is and provincial party is responding to the Federal NDP in this election. And finally, we talk constituency politics. And of course, one of the big issues in Fort Garry that I get letters on is the Southwood homeless encampment. We were going to talk about some of the politics, some of the response from both the city and the province, and what I think would actually solve some of the issues that are facing my constituents. So thank you for joining us. Let's get into it. Joining me today on the podcast is Federal NDP candidate for Winnipeg South Centre, Jorge Requena Ramos. Welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
Okay. Jorge, for those of you who don't know, is a musician in our community, one of the members of Mariachi Ghost. He's also the artistic director at the West End Cultural Center, and he's a business owner and founder of Prairie Boy Productions. Originally born in Mexico, he's been in Winnipeg for a good chunk of his life, and he now lives with his family in Earl Grey neighborhood of the Winnipeg South Centre riding. He's one of my constituents, so I want to welcome you here to the podcast and talk federal politics.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I understand you're running in the Winnipeg South Centre riding, and for those that you don't know, this is probably one of the safest Liberal seats in Western Canada. The NDP have never won this seat. In a good election, they get about 21 to 22% of the vote. And of course, we're hearing from the media that in this federal election, being a Trump election, the NDP voice is really struggling to be heard. And it looks like that polling is going to make this election for the NDP an uphill battle. So with that, I wanted to explore why you got into politics, why you decided to run in this election. And I'll tell you a little story from my background. 20 years ago, I started my political career as the Federal NDP candidate in Winnipeg South Centre in the 2006 election. And I was recruited by the party back then. And I was called to a lunch meeting. I didn't know what it was about. They sat me down and they basically said, "Hey, Mark, we want you to run in the next federal election. You're going to lose and nobody's going to help you." And that was the pitch. So NDP really have to work on their salesmanship. Yeah. But I said yes, and it changed my life. I had a great experience, and despite losing, I had a proud run, and I felt we accomplished a lot of things. So I guess my question to you is, how did you get yourself into this?
That's a good setup. Yeah. I have been looking over the last couple of years at entering politics, and I was not a citizen until last year, so I couldn't do it until I became a citizen. And I watched my friend David Pankratz jump in, into a also really complicated race, and come out victorious. And I have a lot of things to say about Canadian politics and the way that we do things. We were talking a little bit earlier about this outsider looking in perspective, as a first generation immigrant, and a lot of my work has been advocacy. Almost accidentally, it just happens to be right place, right time, that I end up doing some sort of advocacy with my work. And so I wanted to just kind of bring that forward. And a lot of the solutions to the problems that we have normally as people are at the federal level. Like the provinces really don't have that much control over poverty. They have some control over poverty, but it's a federal issue. And so crime is a federal issue to resolve. And so I wanted to be a part of that solution.
Okay. Well, they always say when you're a candidate that you need to answer a couple questions in 20 seconds. So I'll hit you with them. So why did you get into politics in 20 seconds or less? And why you as opposed to the next guy?
I got into politics because I wanted to participate in participatory democracy and do my part for Canada. And why me is because I think I have a unique perspective as a Canadian immigrant to deliver on some things and use my point of comparison with other places as a button to push.
So, I obviously am rooting for you, and I hope that you win. But I think you've been realistic in the press that that you're a dark horse candidate, and you got a bit of a hill to climb. I'll tell you, in my 20 plus years in elected politics, people seem to forget that not only is this a passion for a lot of people, but it's also somebody's job, and often politics attracts opportunists, for lack of a better word, people that get into politics because it's a well-paying job or they want the attention or the prestige. They often can bank on their celebrity status. They might be a media figure or a sports figure, or they have a famous political family name that they can bank on, and they run in ridings where they're absolutely guaranteed to win and there's not sort of any risk to it. Nobody could ever say any of those things about you.
Yeah.
You're doing it the hard way. You're doing it the traditional way. You're doing it the way that I think most Manitobans would expect a politician to do it. But without that, you're don't get the advantages that are faced by other politicians. So I guess to you, what's a win? If you're not successful on October 28th, how will you define a win in this election?
I think if I can push the other two candidates into the right corner, if I can corner them into doing the right thing, I feel like that's enough of a win. And on a personal level, my kid's watching me do this. He's watching his dad set an example and to stepping up and do it the right thing, and not because I'm going to get a job out of it and I'm going to get a paycheck out of it, but because it's the right thing to do.
Okay. How old's your kid?
My kid's 5.
Oh,
he's just excited to see a card with my name on our lawn, But also, like, honestly, a card I had to explain to too many people already that I have 2 last names because I'm a Latin American person. And my poster was complicated for the NDP to design because there's too many words.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a similar thing with your last name. And just being able to plant my flag on my lawn to say I am representing Canada with my background. It's also already a huge source of pride.
Okay. Now, I know a little bit about your politics, and we were talking about it before we went live, but you're passionate about poverty. In fact, you have stated that to you, poverty is a form of oppression. And I think that's a striking statement. It's an interesting statement. Can you tell us what you mean by that? How is poverty a form of oppression?
Okay, it's a bit of a long loop, so I'll get there. My parents grew up in abject poverty. Both of my parents grew up in abject poverty. My dad remembered passing out of hunger when he was little. And they were the first generation that made it to university in their families, and the first generation that became internal migrants. That means that they moved from the rural areas of Mexico to Mexico City, so they became urban folks. But they were bringing all of that generations and generations of poverty to Mexico City. My dad built a giant construction company that for a while was very successful. He was building the largest hospitals and malls and stuff like that. And so there was a huge contrast from his childhood that allowed me to go to private school. And I had access to being with like the wealthy folks of Mexico City. And I remember the attitude of these folks, that it was necessary to keep people poor for them to be wealthy. And I haven't gotten a different sense from the wealthy people in Canada. And I'm sure there are wealthy people who are very kind and nice and have earned their spot. But I remember a lot of people were not like my parents. They were people who were the 3rd or 4th generation that hadn't inherited wealth, and they still believed that poverty was necessary for their success. I think that is an attitude that capitalistic societies have developed in the top of the crop. that those folks really believe that poverty is necessary for their success, and they will it upon the system. They make it happen upon the system. And so keeping people down allows them to make more money. And mathematically, that's how it works, right? Like, if we can keep wages down, we can make more money for ourselves. That's why we have unions, right? Unions are fighting against that oppression. And I also think that because it is a willing thing that we will to happen, is something that we can just stop willing to happen and solve. I think that if we got our heads together as Canadians and decided that we don't want poverty anymore in a first world country with the resources that we have in Canada, we could just do it. It's not that incredible to think about.
So, a Winnipeg South Centre voter, if they wanted to get to the essence of your politics and who you are, is it your fight against poverty that would define your politics?
Yeah, because I think a lot of the problems that we have in Canada can be solved by solving poverty. You know, we're talking about everybody's worried about crime and crime getting really bad. Statistically demonstrated that the great majority of crime is a result of poverty. If we can solve poverty, we can solve a great majority of the crime in Canada, right? And we have, education issues with kids that aren't learning properly because they're hungry. That's something that we can solve by solving poverty. And normally, these things can be solved in a 25-year-old. You look at a 12, 25-year-old schedule and try to move forward past all of these challenges through having solved poverty in the beginning, and then where you can get after solving problems. Poverty, you solve health by solving poverty. You solve diabetes by solving poverty. There's the repercussions of solving poverty are enormous, and it would actually save us money in the long run.
So, Jorge, what are the issues you're hearing at the door when you're door knocking?
People are worried about being able to pay for groceries. A lot of people are really worried. A lot of people are really worried about rent. The cost of rent is something that, especially for younger voters, I had a couple of people that opened the door and really wanted to ask me about what are we planning to do for them to be able to pay the rent in the next 3 or 4 years, because they're already pretty pinched. You know, these are people that just graduated university, are still in university. Our students are in their first job. They just got their first apartment. A couple of people were living with their parents that opened the door. They're the second generation in the home. They're trying to leave, but they can't leave because they just don't have the resources to go pay for an apartment. That's a really interesting place to be at in Canada. That I don't think I had conversations with anybody before 2025 about not being able to leave a generational a household. I mean, obviously, culturally, a lot of people want their kids to live there until they're 30. But wanting to leave and not being able to is a really interesting place to be.
Okay, so Jorge, is there anything that you're hearing at the door that surprised you, that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, younger people are challenged to leave their generational households. We were just talking to a couple of young people that are living in their parents' homes and are finding it really challenging to leave. And I understand culturally, sometimes we want our kids to live in our home until they're already adults, but these are people who really want to leave and are unable to.
Okay. So progressive voters this election are basically stuck if the ballot question is who's the best leader to take on Trump. You have a choice between Pierre Poilievre, which a lot of people find very Trump-like and are very deeply uncomfortable with him as a prime minister, or your other choice with the big parties is Mark Carney, a banker, a central banker, hedge fund investor whose companies have used tax shelters, offshore tax shelters. And if you actually look at the policies of Poilievre or the Liberals, they're almost identical. There isn't a lot of light between them. But Poilievre scares progressive voters. And a lot of them, we're seeing from the polling, are going to vote against their values and vote for an extremely right-wing conservative liberal because he scares them less. And I'm wondering what you're hearing at the door from these progressive voters, and what's your response to them? What are you trying to tell them?
I'm trying to remind them that we need somebody in government that is pushing for the least of us. There's somebody that is pushing against poverty, somebody that is pushing for progressive ideas. We can't just leave it in the middle. Especially with Carney having a slight advantage in the polls right now, that's a good time to sit an NDP person in Ottawa, whoever that is, and I'm worried that we're leaving our goals. That we're putting our goals to the side as if we were actually fighting an actual war. It's not actual war times. We are having an economic dispute with the U.S., but our goals and ideas should still be priorities for our voters. Yeah. I agree with you that Carney is very conservative, and the only difference I see between those two is that Poilievre is just more displeasurable to listen to.
Right. But are you sensing that fear from traditionally progressive voters?
Yeah, and there are a lot of people. That is the most popular thing have said to me at the door. I really would like to vote for you, but I cannot have Poilievre in power. And I don't think that they realize that that the difference is very small. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe Carney has a little bit more kindness in his heart. Let's just put it that way, than Poilievre. But I think we're going to enter a very conservative area of our history in Canada.
Okay. They say in Manitoba that there's sort of two voters, basically conservative voters and those that hate them. And you see that dynamic play out in Winnipeg South Centre, where provincially, almost the entire riding is represented by NDP MLAs. And then federally, it becomes one of the safest Liberal ridings in Western Canada. And so when you are the third candidate in that dynamic, what's your strategy? How do you try to convince people that agree with you but won't vote for you?
I'm just trying to lead with policy. I find that both of the candidates in the riding, the Conservative candidate and the Liberal candidate, have a very thin conversation going about their policies. There's very little to know about what they personally think should be happening in Canada. And so for my first blog post on my website, I started with policy. These are things I believe should be happening in Canada. These are things I would be fighting for if I was in government, because I'm hoping that they're listening. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that the voters are listening and asking for those things, demanding those things from both the Liberal and the Conservative. Mm. Like the environment has fallen to the bottom of our priorities. And it reminds me of an Onion article that says, "Man in dying planet is worried about his stock value." Like, we really need to go back and thinking about those things. And so my goal has been reminding voters about these issues. So when they are casting their ballot, they're also turning around and demanding these things from both the Liberals and the Conservatives. Let's not let them get away with on progressive thinking. Let's still demand that from them.
So one of the other major issues in Winnipeg South Centre is affordable housing. And what are you sort of hearing about it, and what do you think we need to do about it as a community?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people are very worried about their rent, very worried about being able to make the rent, and being very worried about the idea of never being able to own a home, right? Like that, being able to acquire any equity is an impossibility for anybody 18 to 35 right now. It just seems like it would be a miracle for them to be able to own a house. And I had that sense when I was in my 20s also. One of the policies that I've been advocating for, and is now in the NDP main policy agenda, is national rent control. We're about to make a $60 billion investment into housing, and we want to build 1 million housing units in Canada. But right now, 35% of the available housing units are owned by 6 corporations in Canada, and those 6 corporations just keep adding more to their portfolios, which means they can decide the price of rent. And so it doesn't matter how many units we're building. That doesn't make housing more possible or affordable for a lot of people. We also need a policy that allows us to help those people getting to those places. And furthermore, keep the rents low enough that they can save money so they can actually buy a house. We're building rental units right now. That's concerning.
Yeah.
We don't have a strategy that allows people to own their own home and become free of having that bill every month. That's not something that we're working towards right now. And we really should be in a first world country. And we really should be in Winnipeg South Centre. Do you want your kids that grew up in Winnipeg South Centre to move outside of Winnipeg South Centre? Because that is what you're pushing for when you're voting Liberal and Conservative. You're pushing your kids out of the neighborhood. You're pricing your kids out of the neighborhood they grew up, the neighborhoods they grew up in.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because, people are struggling in Manitoba with the fastest growing rents in the country, yet we are a rent control province, and people don't understand that disconnect. And for people listening, the reason for that is we have a loophole in the Manitoba law called an above guideline rent increase, where your landlord can apply to the province of Manitoba after doing cosmetic renovations like some paint or some flooring, which they would most likely do anyways. And the province will give them an exemption. And some of these exemptions are 10 to 30% increase in rent in a year, which has now made us the leading province in Canada for the fastest growing rent. So despite having rent control in Manitoba, it doesn't seem to work. So it's compelling that you think that we can sort of solve this problem at the federal level, because there's not any sort of appetite in the Canoe government to actually close that loophole. What do you sort of feel about that dynamic, that push-pull between federal politics and provincial politics, and why we need to solve certain issues at the federal level?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying about us needing to have a federal strategy for these things, a federal strategy for poverty that mandates provinces to do certain things that they have no choice but to mandate these things, because the poverty is being felt across the whole country, and leveling the playing field has to be a Canada-wide policy. Otherwise, we're also going to be losing people from Manitoba going into other provinces because they can't afford to live here, right? If you want to keep your kids in your community, we need to make those communities livable for them.
Now, you were born in Mexico, and I'm curious about being a newcomer and getting involved in politics, and how that sort of affects your worldview. I know my own personal experience. My mother immigrated from Ukraine, and it was a newcomer family. And growing up in, even being Canadian born, but growing up in that type of household, you see things differently. You have different experiences than maybe just native-born Manitobans or Canadians have. And I know it's deeply impacted my politics and how I got to where I am today. And I'm curious to see if you agree, whether this has impacted you, and how you would say, it's affected your politics.
Definitely. It's a outsider looking in has been a huge part of my experience as an immigrant here, and of course, I had never experienced poverty until I moved to Canada, until I moved to the first world, and became an immigrant. I understand the loss of privilege coming from. I went to university here. I was an international student, and I was very privileged to be able to do that coming from another country. We are able to observe the things that are happening in Canada with a certain amount of skepticism, because what we've done our whole lives has been different, and we're learning the things that are happening in Canada as we watch them happen. And sometimes we say, you would do that different. That's something that could be happening differently. That's something that happens differently in other countries. Why aren't we doing this other idea? You're just doing this because you're used to doing this. And it's been a super interesting journey with a lot of friends, having conversations about, hey, how about this thing that we do differently in Mexico, that they do different in Spain, that they do different in France. And it makes the Canadian tapestry so strong to have so many perspectives coming from all over the world. And people thinking in other languages in their heads and processing ideas in a different way. It just makes Canada such a strong place to be able to have all of these perspectives in. And in terms of my politics, I'm looking at Canada turning into a country more like the Mexico that I left. You know, the poverty is growing. There's more homelessness. And people are more staunch in their views. When I first came to Canada, people's views were more flexible. And I understand that we are in a world of more divisiveness now, but I'm watching people corner themselves into their camps in a really strange way, and I'm watching it, trying to keep that point of view, that vantage point of an immigrant person watching my peers and obviously my Canadian brethren with that continuous skeptical look, so that I can continue to contribute in that way. It is really hard to migrate to Canada, and also having the perspective of what the empathy for other immigrants that are arriving, and just the consciousness that the Canadian experience, the Canadian project of nation cannot exist without immigrants. We just don't have kids fast enough. And without immigration, our economy would collapse. You know, when's the last time you went to a Tim Hortons and you saw, you know, a teenager that grew up in the neighborhood working in that Tim Hortons? It's all immigrants. We're doing all those jobs. I certainly have done all those jobs in my experience. And it's really hard to escape that part of the immigrant experience. But we need those immigrants. And because we need those immigrants, their experiences need to be valuable and their contributions need to be acknowledged. And so that's another thing that I think is very important for politicians to jump into the conversation with. We need those people. Without them, the economy is going to collapse. So let's give them the importance that they deserve at the policy level. And let's give them the importance that they deserve just as your neighbors. If you have neighbors from somewhere else in the world, make sure you're checking in on them. It gets really hard for them as we start redefining the Canadian identity and all this, like, you know, proud to be Canadian. Let's jump on board for this like Canada train. Sometimes they feel excluded in that. They are part of that Canada train. And let's make sure they're included in that Canada train.
Well, I know you're a big believer in inclusive politics, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how passionate you are about youth voting. And then, of course, we know that young people in Manitoba, the majority of them don't vote. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think young people feel excluded from, I'm going to air quotes, the game. Mm-hmm. They don't feel like they have been invited into participatory democracy. And they feel like there's very little to gain for them to be in participatory democracy. They really would like to own a house. They really would like to have an independent life in a nice neighborhood where they can have their own car and go out for coffee. And, you know, the things that we thought North American living, the North American dream were about, those kids aren't getting. And they know it, and they're kind of jaded from it. It's super interesting to have a generation of jaded 18 to 25-year-olds, right? Whereas with the time where we're supposed to be glossy-eyed about the possibilities, they're full of possibility, right? They're full of potential. But the society they're looking at in the future has zero potential in their eyes.
Right.
And to engage them, we need to remind them that they're the government. That is not us that are working in politics. That is the government. That it is them electing us that have the power. That we are public servants serving them. I feel like we've lost that lingo. And it's super important to remind them that we're not leaders. We're servants. We have to do their bidding. And they have to demand it from us. And they demand it from us by voting, but also by participating, by volunteering, by actively sending letters, by making sure that they're at events, by making sure that they're pushing those buttons. And right now they just don't care. And so I'm trying to engage with them. And I'm trying to get them to vote for anybody. Just vote, please. You know, for the love of God, just vote.
Yeah. Well, is that one of your goals for your campaign? Of you're nodding your head, sort of creating the next generation of activists, or getting people with progressive politics into politics? Because when your choice is bad or worse, It's not inspiring. It doesn't get people out the door to vote.
Yeah, and what's one of the reasons why I keep saying that I want to run a punk rock campaign, I want those young people to know that it's okay to, can I swear on this thing?
Of course.
That it's okay to call bullshit. It's okay to call bullshit. And it's okay to be honest about your feelings about politics. You don't have to be polite about it, right? Speaking truth to power is a cornerstone of the punk ideals, right? And we need to be doing that. We need to be telling the politicians when the emperor is just standing there naked. If we're not doing that, then we're going to lose democracy. So it's super important that we have that unapologetic, nonconformist idea of politics, because our voices need to be heard in society. Otherwise, the point of society is completely gone.
Yeah, no, I love that. I grew up in Winnipeg in the punk alternative scene in the 90s and the turn of the century there. And so I hear you about punk rock politics, that we're losing that sort of do-it-yourself, challenging authority. Our politics, I think, I've certainly seen this firsthand, is becoming much more top-down, much more authoritarian, much more conformist. And we actually sort of chase people out that have individual views. Which I think we're losing something in our politics. But let's talk about underdog politics, right? You are the underdog in this race. Mm-hmm. What are you up against compared to the other major parties? And how is this sort of a tougher hill for you to climb than for, say, the major parties? I'm
gonna flip the script on you on this one. I think there's enormous power in being the underdog because I have so much less to lose than the other two guys. Like, they think they're really going at each other with each other, but really, I'm allowed to point out the flaws in their arguments, and I am allowed to take them to task on certain things, and I'm allowed to tell Ben Carr, you're not a progressive at all. Like, you're pretending to be progressive, you're pretending to be inclusive, you're going by a script that you're continuously reading, but you're not delivering on it, right? And so, because I'm not expecting to win, I'm able to tell the truth, and that is a huge advantage. And that is the reason I'm standing here, is because I have that platform to be able to speak truth to power.
Yeah. What does that say about our politics? That you have to very much be guaranteed to lose in order to actually speak truth to people and tell people what's what. I mean, how does that, jive with our democracy? What does that say about our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a sad state of affairs that there has to be somebody volunteering 37 days of their lives to coming and telling people what they should, like things that are obvious to people already, right? Telling politicians things that are obvious to their constituencies that they can't see themselves because they're chasing that paycheck. And I understand, like, I super understand, but a political career, and maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot out of a political career right now in this particular moment, but I'm not in it to get a paycheck. I'm in it to tell the truth, and I have that power right now, which I'm enjoying the moment of being able to do that.
So just sort of wrapping up here, if the polls are correct, and there's no reason to believe that they're not, Mark Carney and the Liberals are heading towards a huge majority government, and they're going to gain seats this election. And it looks like, unfortunately, because people are fearful of Pierre Poilievre, a lot of progressive voters are going to be ending up voting liberally and holding their nose to do it. And that's going to hurt NDP seats. And the NDP is probably going to lose seats. And when you lose seats, you lose a voice. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about our future of federal politics in Canada. If New Democrats aren't in the chamber in big numbers, if their voice isn't getting heard, when you have two very right-wing political parties that are in the chamber, how is that going to affect Canadian politics going forward?
This is the outsider looking in perspective. There's two possibilities. One possibility is that we turn into a two-party system, and we know how that goes, right? We know that all of the quote unquote left is lumped into one side and all of the quote unquote right is lumped onto the other side. And it just helps to radicalize the right. And like a rule of systems of oppression is that systems of oppressions sort of continue to put themselves into the oppressive chair and continue to become more oppressive if you let them. That's why we have government, is to stop systems of oppression from perpetuating, right? Systems of oppression are perpetuating. And so a two-party system is only going to move people into a further system of oppression. And we might stay there if this is what we let happen. We need a third party to keep those two sides honest. That is the counterbalance of, and look at what we've gotten out of the counterbalance of power, right? We've gotten our enviable healthcare system. This like a crown of the world, right? We've gotten, and just in this government, like dental care, pharma care, and the child care system, the $10 daycare, which is insane, right? Those things are super important, and without having that counterbalance of power, we're losing the possibility of doing those things. And we're never going to have electoral reform. We're never going to, right? And the other option is, like in other countries, is that the left becomes so fed up that it becomes a two-party system for 15 minutes. And then there's a surge from people in the left that find an identity together in the frustration of these things, and then lift a whole other side of government and create, a more progressive state of affairs. I'm hoping that's the result. Certainly, that's what happened with Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, right? She came into that third leg after there was like almost 100 years of a two-party system in Mexico. That third party became the party of the people, and the most poor people in Mexico were massively frustrated. And so this has happened in other places also, right? But I'm hoping that is the result of this. And like we're as an NDP, we're going to take a licking in this particular election. And I think we all know it. And I'm really crossing my fingers for Leela and for Leah. Leah is the person that told me to run. And I find her so inspiring. And we really need her to get in. Just such a powerful voice for the people. And then the rest of us are going to have to go home and like heal our wounds and do some thinking and get ready for the next fight. And we have to make sure we keep those politicians honest. We have to keep them worried about our opinions. We have to make sure that they're serving us even after they get in. We have to make sure of that. That is our role in between the elections. That's what we have to do.
Well, this is Jorge Requena Ramos, and I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak to the podcast.
Thank you.
The Federal NDP candidate for Winnipeg South Centre, potentially my MP, and I certainly full-throated endorse Mr. Ramos here. I think he'd be an excellent MP, and I absolutely love your punk rock politics. I think we need more punk rock politics, both in Manitoba politics and in federal politics. And I know you still got a bit of a sprint going, but best of luck on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
With the federal election upon us, I've noticed a definite shift in the political culture in Manitoba. I've been an NDP activist for the past 25 years, since I moved back to Manitoba from Quebec after university, and I was involved in getting NDP candidates elected. And in fact, in 2006, I was the federal NDP candidate in Winnipeg South Centre, and that ended up launching my political career. I've gone on to stand in 6 elections, 5 of them successfully, and I've been an elected politician for the past 14 years. And I'm really troubled this election by the changes I'm seeing, which I don't think are for the better. Now, if you're an NDP supporter or an activist, you don't see the NDP like other political parties. It's a social movement, and it really sort of sees itself as a social movement, one that speaks to truth to power, that lifts up voices that have been excluded from the democratic process. It's not just about getting elected for a job, it's about advocating for change. And it's just as important to do these things, even if you don't actually win, where the other 2 major parties tend to be just focused on winning. And if we didn't have NDP voices in Canadian politics, we wouldn't have universal health care or pharmacare or dental care or a ban on replacement workers or a whole host of progressive policies that we take for granted. And by Canada having NDP voices in Parliament, it's actually pushed our country in a more progressive direction. And ironically enough, when our country feels like it's under siege by the Americans, it's those differences that we point to that show how we are a unique and different country. And so NDP progressive policies have been central to defining who we are as Canadians. And it's the threat of losing those policies and becoming just like the Americans that's concerning to Manitobans and Canadians. And in fact, one of the progressive concerns with Pierre Poilievre is that the Conservatives federally want to make us more like the United States, not less like them. And the jury's still out whether the federal Liberals want to make us more like the U.S. or whether they will actually stand up for what makes us unique. So unlike other political parties, we're not just vying for power, and that we believe that, in a set of principles that exists despite who our leader is. And that's unlike other parties. Other parties basically dramatically change their belief system depending on what their leader believes. So the other change or difference between the NDP and the other major parties is that the NDP sees itself as one political party, both federally and provincially. If you're a member of a provincial NDP, you're automatically a member of the federal NDP. And one of the sort of governing values of being an NDPer is solidarity. We believe in supporting one another. We believe in collective action. Now, I'll bring you back to 2006 when I ran federally. At the time, there was a provincial NDP government in power. I had their full support. They had experienced campaign managers who ended up taking vacation time to work full-time on my political campaign. And my political campaign had the full sort of backing of the provincial NDP. They provided party lists, help with fundraising, locating supporters and sign locations. They provided data. And you don't start from scratch. You have this whole infrastructure that's there to help you. And you had experienced team members, activists that helped elect a provincial government that now use their skills and experience to try to help you. So it was one party infrastructure. In fact, the federal NDP had a full-time organizer who worked out of the Manitoba provincial NDP offices, and there was that working together and that solidarity. So you had local NDP MLAs help out in my campaign, and they mentored me, which is incredibly important. Being a politician doesn't come with an instruction manual, and people have to teach you how to do the job. And so we were one team. You fast forward to politics today in 2025. That's all broken down. Wab Kinew, NDP Premier for Manitoba, as the time that we're taping this on April 11th, has not endorsed the federal NDP or local federal NDP and MP candidates in this election. And contrast that with David Eby, who's the BC NDP Premier, had no trouble doing that very early on in the election. He stood alongside Jagmeet Singh and formally endorsed him. And I've been told by NDP activists who were actually looking to run federally that they had been threatened by provincial NDP officials that if they stand as a federal NDP candidate, that they would have no future with the provincial NDP and couldn't run as future provincial NDP candidates. They're actually being bullied out of putting their name forward. It is so hard to find qualified, dedicated, hardworking candidates for any election, especially if you're running in a place where you have no chance of winning or very little chance of winning. And we have a provincial wing of our party actively discouraging people from doing that. And I've been told that the provincial NDP has also refused to provide voter contact information, membership lists to the federal NDP, and that's just unheard of. And I think what I'm hearing is that concerns in the provincial NDP and the Wab Kinew's party is that they're worried that the federal government will fundraise off those lists, and that'll somehow take money out of the provincial NDP's fundraising pool. And again, that notion is unheard of. You stop being one political party if you see the federal party as competition and that you're trying to block and obstruct them from actually doing well. And here's the kicker. Manitoba NDP MLAs are going out into the community telling people that they've been barred by the party from actively endorsing or helping federal party candidates. And again, as of today, I am the only MLA for Winnipeg South Centre, or just anywhere for that matter, who's been affiliated with the NDP, who has endorsed federal NDP candidates. So the whole notion of solidarity has broken down, and the whole notion of one party has broken down. And that's the culture now. And the Manitoba NDP has more in common under Wab Kinew ideologically with the PC party in Manitoba than they do with the federal NDP. They don't see themselves as one movement or one party, and there's this competition, this hostility, lack of mutual support, at least coming from the provincial wing. And I think a lot of Manitoba NDP activists would be shocked by this and disappointed and deeply hurt. That is absolutely not the culture, and it wasn't the culture before Wab Kinew became the leader of the party. And it's very much indicative of the modern Manitoba NDP, where it's basically become an instrument for the leader's ambition, and that it isn't about supporting voices or communities anymore, and it's about getting them reelected. So this is going to be a tough election for the federal NDP. The electorate is very polarized. The question is, who's the best premier to stand up or I guess best prime minister to stand up for Donald Trump? And if you're the leader of the third party, like the New Democrats are, you're not going to have a voice in that discussion. You're not going to be taken seriously. You're not going to get media. And we're seeing the poll results reflect that. And the pundits are predicting losses in this federal election for the NDP. Now, we have 3 seats in Manitoba. On a normal election, they would be considered quite safe. This isn't a normal election. I think there's been lots of media coverage saying all 3 are particularly vulnerable. I hope that's not the case, but polling tends to be accurate. But the real danger is if we lose some of these very safe seats with some of these very excellent MPs that are leaders in Parliament and punch above their weight, even though the members of what's now the 4th largest party in Parliament. So Manitoba NDP in the past would step in. It would provide political infrastructure for the federal party in Manitoba. That's no longer happening. And on October 29th, Manitoba NDP activists could wake up to find a federal party that's lost some or all of its seats in Manitoba, and that will be shocking. But even more shocking will be that Wab Kinew had specifically and intentionally took actions that hurt our federal candidates and obstructed the help that they would normally get. And Manitoba NDP members will have to face the reality that their premier helped elect Conservatives and Liberals to Parliament. So in this segment of the podcast, I like to talk about what I'm hearing as a MLA in my constituency. And one of the issues that I get quite a bit of mail from is the homeless encampment in the south part of my riding. Now, in Fort Garry, there is a major encampment along the Red River in the University Heights neighborhood. It's come to be known in the media as the Southwood encampment. Now, this encampment's been around for about 6 years, and it started off as a seasonal encampment, which meant that in good weather, people would be out there living. But as soon as things became freezing, winter comes around, it would empty out. Now, under the PCs, people were actually living in transit shelters. That wasn't too long ago. And all down Pembina Highway, including in University Heights area, there would be homeless people living in the transit shelters. When the Kinew government took over, they actually put a concerted effort into getting people out of transit shelters, and it worked really well. You do not see people living in transit shelters anymore in Manitoba. In this last cold winter, that just didn't happen. The problem with that was that they didn't have any social housing built. So although these people were no longer living in transit shelters, they had to go somewhere. So where did they go? So they got pushed out of the transit shelters and they went to encampments. And you saw all across Winnipeg new encampments spring up and the old ones get bigger. And that was also true with the Southwood encampment. So people wouldn't live there year round. And all of a sudden this past winter, that changed. People were now living in the encampment year round. And now I'm told from recent letters from my constituents that as things have warmed up, the encampment is expanding and growing and more people are moving in. So instead of shrinking and disappearing the encampments, they're actually growing and expanding. Now, the Southwood encampment, unlike many of the downtown encampments, is in a residential area. This is a wooded area along the river, and directly feet across from it, across a road, two-lane road, are houses. And I don't know of too many other encampments where, family homes are directly adjacent to a encampment. And there's many seniors and students living in the immediate vicinity. And with encampments, there comes a lot of social problems, and we know this. Residents have seen a spike in petty crime and vandalism, discarded needles in front of their homes and on their sidewalks, police having routinely to come into the neighborhood to deal with people who are in crisis and are having issues, and fires. Lots and lots of fires. It's probably the most concerning public safety issue about this is that there are being fires, uncontrolled fires set in a wooded area mere feet away from the house. And one resident tells me that they alone have seen 6 fires and have had to call the fire department for them to extinguish these 6 fires, that other residents have also seen fires and have to call them in. And there's been a fire just weeks ago, again, in this area. And of course, homeless people need to move stuff around, and so they bring in shopping carts. So they get abandoned, and you have this whole sort of parking lot of abandoned shopping carts. And if you're interested, my constituents have sent lots of pictures to see what this looks like, and you can go to any of my socials and see those pictures on there. Now, when I talk to the residents in this area, these aren't sort of not in my backyarders. These are people who are thoughtful, that they understand that this is a social problem. They are concerned about the people, their homeless neighbors who live in the encampment. They want them supported. They want them help. The issue is that it doesn't seem to be happening. There's absolutely no urgency with the Canoe government. In fact, this encampment's been around for 6 years. And the problem is it creates a tension between the people who live in the neighborhood and those who live in the encampment. So nobody wants out-of-control fires started across the street from the house where their children sleep. Nobody wants to walk their dog in a neighborhood and worry about their dog getting punctured by a used needle. Nobody wants to go to their garden shed and discover their lawnmower has been stolen yet for the 3rd time. Nobody wants to look out their front window to a sea of discarded waste, garbage, and abandoned shopping carts. Now, the Premier and the Minister of Housing, they wouldn't tolerate this if this was occurring across from their house, and neither should the constituents of Fort Garry. I mean, 6 years of this going on. So, some background as to the politics of this. Last year in July, I was contacted by constituents in the area seeking help. I contacted the minister's office, told them about the issue and that we needed to respond. And I was told at that time by the minister's office that the issue was communal housing, that they hadn't built any communal housing, and that people in encampments, which is true, do not feel safe in our shelters. And when they live in an encampment, they build community. They have their role in that little sort of community, and they have their support networks, and you can't break that up. These people rely upon that on survival. So the idea is that you have to move them en masse to a new housing unit where they can stay together and keep their mutual support networks, keep their community together. That makes sense to me. I fully support it. And in July of last year, that I was told that we hadn't done that as a province, and so we couldn't move them until that was done. And so, a year later, almost, there's been no announcement of communal shelters or housing being built to house or transition these encampments. So we know that that wasn't accurate or true, and that nothing had come of it. But the advice for the minister at the time, a year ago, was that if you are a Manitoban facing an encampment, you should call the city. It's the city's problem. You should call 311. Well, my residents, my constituents took that advice, and they contacted City of Winnipeg. They contacted the local councillor, and the councillor's response was, well, you know, it's the province's responsibility to provide housing. Yeah, that is absolutely true. Province's responsibility to provide social services, and that's clearly not happening, and that also is true. So in short, the response from the city and from the councillor was that it's not our problem, it's the province's problem. So just yesterday, when we were updating the minister's office, that this problem was getting worse, not better, that there had been another fire, and we had sent off pictures showing that things are getting worse in that area. I get a response from the deputy minister of housing, basically being identical to what I had almost a year ago, going, call the city, call 311. No plan, no resources, no basically an abdication of responsibility. And it was clear that this ministry has no solutions here. And it is not reasonable for this community to wait 6 years for action. And it is irresponsible for the city to do next to nothing. It's irresponsible for the province to, quite frankly, do nothing. At some point, Wabkanu has a moral duty to this community. He has to take leadership. He has to stop passing the buck, and he has to provide resources to mitigate the situation. If we accept that they don't have the staff in place to provide wraparound services, if we accept that they haven't acquired social housing to transition these folks, and that takes time, that doesn't change the fact that these two communities are in conflict. And the reason they're in conflict is that the homeless community does not have services. And if the province steps in and either pays the city to do it, or if the city is reluctant to do it because they're underfunded to do it themselves, they need to provide services in order to mitigate the conflict between these two communities. That means routine and regular garbage disposal. It means removing the debris that's leading to these uncontrolled fires. It means needle drop boxes so we can get the needles off the sidewalks and the roads. It means porta potties and portable water so the people that are required to live in these encampments that don't have better options have some dignity and health surrounding their everyday lives. And we need regular support workers, not just showing up because somebody called 311 and they have to prove that they responded to the call, but somebody that's going every day, establishing relationships, finding out what these people need and connecting them with supports. All that costs money. All that is in provincial jurisdiction. What we're missing here is political will. Now, I've been raising this for a couple of years now inside the NDP, and the pushback I got and the concern I got would be the politics of this. How would it look if the government started basically providing dignity to people who live in encampments, providing services like garbage removal and porta potties and water? And would we be perceived or attacked by the Conservatives for basically making it more livable and therefore encouraging encampments? And that's where people go with this stuff, that we're somehow encouraging this. We're not. These things are going to happen whether we like it or not. The question is, are they going to be as safe as they can be, whether these people live in as much dignity as they possibly can, and whether or not we actually are supporting all Manitobans, or we're picking and choosing who we help. So you got to be fair to all people living in this situation. The community has been very open-minded and hasn't sort of defaulted to that sort of aggressive, well, just take the police and clear them out. We know that doesn't work. People will just come back, and we don't need to create more violence in our community. And quite frankly, there's been Canadian law that's saying forcible removal of encampments is unconstitutional. So To solve this in the short term, we need government to act and to reduce conflict and provide services to both the housed and unhoused community. It's time for Wild Canoe to show some courage and leadership and actually address this issue and stop passing the buck to the city. People living in Southwood Encampment and their neighbours deserve no less. Thank you very much for joining us for our second edition of the Ledge podcast. I want to thank Jorge Requena Ramos. He's going to be an amazing candidate for the Federal NDP in Winnipeg South Centre. We're glad to have him on the show and to endorse him. You can check out his campaign on Instagram. And if you're so inclined, please help him out. We need more progressive candidates in Manitoba. He's certainly going to be part of the future of Manitoba politics. If you want to hear more or see more about what I'm doing at the Manitoba Legislature, we're on all the social media channels. We'd also love to hear your feedback from you about the podcast. And you can reach me by email at mark@markvasiliumla.ca. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.